Welcome to the Courage to Be podcast with Tanya Vasallo. Before we get into this episode, I want to share with you that I'm on a mission to close the gender gap in the podcasting world so that more and more women's voices are heard. If you feel that this is something you value too, then please rate, review, and share the podcast. And in exchange, and as my way to say thank you to you, I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. All you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobe@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course. Welcome back to the Courage to Be, where we have powerful conversations to transform your life and your business. And today we have Jon Berghoff with us. Jon, welcome.
Hi, Tanya. Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to see where we go with everything. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what kind of work you do so that our audience understands a little bit of your background.
Yeah, happy to. Well, I'm a parent. I'm a partner. I've got 5 kids, and it's summer here in Ohio, so I'm a baseball coach, and it's baseball season. I coach my 10-year-old son, Kaizen, and that's on my mind. We got a big tournament this weekend. At work, when I'm not coaching youth baseball, our interest is in the magic of what is possible when groups of people come together. And more specifically, as you know, we teach a methodology so that whether it's a meeting of any type or a training or a workshop, in fact, you were telling me you just finished leading an in-person event, and that's awesome. And anywhere where we're trying to make a difference, where we bring people together and the purpose is to learn, to tap into our creativity, resilience, to create meaningful relationships in these groups. That's our biggest curiosity, is what is it that taps into that collective potential? Because there's a very practical opportunity. There's so many places where we gather for good reason. And, that's our greatest interest at Xchange, as you know. I'm happy to talk about any of that or none of that, really, whatever you want.
Yes, I would love to hear more about it, especially coming out of the pandemic. And I got to experience Xchange and your incredible energy and how you bring people together and groups together. I mean, what you guys have created has just been amazing. So I would love for you to share with our audience, because they haven't experienced your magic of how to bring people together, how to shift things so that we can be more connected. It's to me, for like you just mentioned, coming out of a in-person retreat that I just led, because I was doing them online. It was easier, like once pandemic hit and we had to all figure out and pivot. I'd love to hear a little bit of your perspective, how that was before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and how you guys got to connect people, because that's when I experienced it. And then how is it looking now? What have been the gifts? Because to me, the gift was, I can still get people connected online. But now there was something wonderful that just happened this weekend, when I led this 3-day event and connecting. I missed the in-person energy. So I'd love to hear your transitions, perspectives, what things have shifted, and then the importance of connection. I love this topic, Jon, so we can dive deeper with it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, just to paint a picture, so where are we? June 6th. So this year, our team at Xchange, we will probably design and facilitate somewhere between 120 and 150 trainings, workshops that range from 2 hours to 3 days online. And we'll have, I don't know how many thousands of people will come through these. I will get on a plane twice this year. Actually, 3 times. I've gotten on a plane twice to facilitate a small number of kind of global leadership. I don't travel, and that's by design, and it didn't always used to be that way, because to your point, we've learned a ton out of necessity when the pandemic arrived in 2020. And I'm sure both you and I and anybody who's thinking about this can probably remember where they were like the second week of March 2020. When all of the sudden it's like this new reality is immediately settling in, that what? We can't get together in person? And before the pandemic, we taught our methodology to coaches and consultants and folks that wanted to run effective leadership development trainings or build communities of different types. And the only thing we ever did was done in person. So we were sitting there at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's a whole other story of how we had to kind of do some soul searching and look in the mirror and ask some key questions, kind of take our own medicine, which is based a lot around the questions we ask, right? And what it led to was finding a place of creativity and generosity and innovation. And all of a sudden now we do everything online. And what I think is fascinating is one person could hear like this conversation and be thinking, well, another online meeting, that's the last thing I want to be a part of. And if somebody had that thought, I would absolutely understand and respect why they might have that thought, because I actually believe, Tanya, most of the world made it through this pandemic without discovering how much we can actually do online. And I don't mean like, oh, we can work at home now and we can do things remote and how cool is that? I mean, everybody kind of started to see that. But what you learned by coming through one of our trainings is that we can actually design and facilitate experiences that don't just move the learning from like passive to interactive. It can be transformational. And it's not just we're all in the same meeting. We can design and facilitate conversations that people have, even 200 people in a training breaking into small groups, that create deep, powerful, meaningful human connection. And we can do all this in ways where people feel a sense of belonging, which I think people need right now more than ever, even if they're not consciously looking for it. And we can talk about all these things, but we've learned a lot. There's a lot that's possible. And the business that we're in, which is teaching, how do you design and facilitate these transformational group experiences? We were on record in 2017, 18, 19, talking about how the way that we lead, teach, and convene groups, it already needed to be totally thrown out the door and reinvented. And we needed new methods that tap into collective creativity, that build connection at speed and at scale. And the pandemic just accelerated us finding a way to do it online. And our method also works in person. So we've learned a ton, and we're still surprised at what's possible in these different types of gatherings. So I'm happy to go wherever your curiosity wants to go on that.
Yeah, I have so many questions. I guess let's start with why is it important to learn to facilitate? Like, because I think this is important. Why is it important and who is it important for? Because some people might just like, oh, well, this doesn't pertain to me. I work at an office, or this doesn't pertain to me. I'm a teacher. And I would invite everyone to reevaluate and just reconsider, because I would love for you to share why is it important to learn how to connect people, learn how to facilitate groups.
Oh my gosh. I love the way you're framing these two questions. Why is it important and who for? It's important because our world is collapsing, and it's important for every single living person. I'm being outrageous, but some might say you're not. You know, let me use a couple stories or real examples to try and illuminate this, trying to decide which one to pick. So at the start of the pandemic, where we went from, we had trained 200 people in our method for the prior 5 years to training thousands within months because we could, right? Just that alone was very illuminating. So we're meeting people all over the world. And there were a group of women that came through our online trainings, the very first ones we were hosting, and they were all part of an organization called Women Presidents Organization. And I had never worked with Women Presidents Organization, but these women were all chapter chairs. They were all facilitators of all the local chapters for this global network of women who are all leaders of businesses. And so, which to me, this is so meaningful. And as they're coming through our trainings, learning how to design and facilitate these interactions online, I think one of the things that I appreciated so deeply, still do today, that WPO appreciated, is that being able to design and facilitate, because these are two skills that have to go together. If I want to create a powerful group experience, it's not just how do I facilitate it, it's the actual design of it as well. But being able to create these powerful learning experiences, in the case of these women president chapters that are coming together, it was key. And let's just talk about why, because I think we could probably all relate to this. The world at that time, and it still is true today, I believe, was changing in ways that nobody felt equipped to adapt to it, right? And by the way, this idea that, the world's changing faster than humans can adapt, that's not an idea that was born in 2020. We've been telling that story for 6 years because we were introduced to this idea by Eric Teller, a longtime executive at Google X, who put forward this hypothesis many years ago that literally the world is changing faster than humans can adapt. 2020 just made that more obvious, I think. So as we're working with these chapter chairs, why is it important for them to be able to bring together these peers to learn together? Well, because when any of us individually or collectively or in teams or communities, it doesn't matter. When any of us are trying to navigate problems we've never dealt with before, deal with things that we don't have answers to, we have to be able to tap into a deeper wisdom, a deeper intelligence. And one of the most practical places where we can tap that deeper wisdom is when we come together to learn, to think, to create, to solve in groups and in communities and in teams. Because there is such thing as a collective intelligence. So why do we need to learn how to design and facilitate? Because once we see that a group of people is this living system and there is intelligence that we can tap into that's far more than the sum of the parts, once we see that that's possible, anyone who's listening who's ever been a part of any group experience, a training, a gathering, a workshop, or a team where they witnessed something transformational that happened collectively, they got to see, hear, and feel this magic that's there. And what we've become curious about is how do we tap into that every time, and how do we do it quickly online or in person? So we need this skill right now more than ever because people need to be led, but we need a new type of leadership. It's not about what do the few of us know that we're just going to tell everybody else. We don't need that many more sages that stand on stages. I'm not diminishing you or I as teachers. But what I'm saying is we also need a brand new capability to be revered and respected as much as these so-called thought leaders, which is the skill of bringing out everybody else's expertise. That's what we do. That's our interest. And which starts to point to your second question, which who should be interested in this? Anybody who's sitting in a meeting thinking, I don't think this meeting is the best use of time. You even need to learn how to facilitate when you don't have the title, right? Or anybody who does have responsibility, influence over a group coming together out of respect for that limited, scarce resource of time, not just the money we're spending, should be interested in how do we tap into that collective potential. So I'll stop and go wherever you want that to go.
That's fabulous because that's exactly what I experienced when I went through one of your programs. I was just like, wow, Jon and his team. The way I experienced it was you have this capacity of pulling out, like you said, from all of us collectively to rise up to our leadership versus here's how you should teach, get up on the stage and you should lead this way or you should speak this way, and so that was beautifully said. I couldn't have said it with any better words. Did you notice any difference from online to in person, Jon? Like even now, as you guys are adapting and bringing new things from online to in person and vice versa, like, is there a hybrid? What have been some of the differences of learning to facilitate online and in person?
Well, one of the, I think, very practical questions that somebody encouraged us to ask right at the start of the pandemic was, okay, number one, what's everything that was awesome about everything we did in person? And are there ways to recreate that online? And I'll give you an example. When you meet in person, people often point out that some of the most meaningful, spontaneous interactions and relationships that are formed happen during the breaks or before the meeting starts or after the meeting. So we realize, we can actually run our meetings and our trainings in ways where we designate 30 minutes before people can show up and we can actually move them into small groups spontaneously, uncontrolled, unpredictably, and they can build relationships and network and connect. And it's like, okay, we can actually recreate that. And then we started bringing live musicians in because they could just click a button and come play live music. And it's like, we can actually have a lot of fun too. We can make this engaging and we can do important work. But that's just an example of, we started to discover things that we could recreate. And then here's where it got exciting. A lot of the things that we used to do in person, which is how we developed the Xchange methodology, we noticed worked even better. And then we noticed there's actually things we can do online that we could never do in person. For example, a big part of what we do is designing and facilitating interactions where I might have a team of 50 people, and we move in and out of different configurations of small groups, even pairs or groups of 3, 4, or 5, to learn from each other, or just to start to generate solutions to difficult challenges, whether it's for me personally or for us as a team or whatever it may be. And there's a need when facilitating these small group interactions for people to be able to feel psychologically safe enough to really be able to share what they want to share. And we can talk a lot about psychological safety because it's one of the critical preconditions that we want to continually nurture in any group setting. Well, here's what's fascinating. We had people tell us immediately at the first beginning of the pandemic, when we're doing everything online, they said, I feel more intimacy. I feel a willingness to open up, to be safe. I feel that online 10 times more than when I'm in a room and there's lots of other people in that room. And for some reasons that are obvious and maybe some that are not. I mean, just we're in the comfort of a space, like you're wherever you're at. I'm in our offices. A lot of people are coming out of their homes, and there's a certain security that people feel that way. There's a certain intimacy when there's just two of us looking at each other on the screen. And there's something really cool that's possible online that we can't even recreate in person. And then a last thing I'll say, Tanya, I think what I'm hearing in your question, you started to allude to this. What we got really interested in is when we saw how much was possible online. And there's things you have to do to make all that work. And we can talk about those practical lessons if we want, like how you invite people and what kind of agreements people make about being present. Because someone could hear this and go, really? Engaging things online? I'm in these meetings where half the cameras are off and who knows, I know what I'm doing, on my email, other things. Well, that's a problem, right? But that's actually a problem that the convener has to take ownership of, not look at everyone else and get demoralized by it and say, why are we here? Because we should have that thought if we're really not engaged. So knowing what kind of agreements to create up front just around presence, not anything else, just around, hey, let's actually treat this with respect. That's just, things we do beforehand, let alone while we're facilitating. But what we saw was, oh my gosh, because of what we can do online, we shouldn't even treat an in-person gathering the way we used to. We should completely blow up our whole model of what we think is a good use of time in person. Why would we have people fly in or travel in and sit them in rows like this is some factory and have 3 people spend 4 hours in one direction passing information along, when for 30 years we already have learned we can disseminate, record, and consume content when we want, where we want, how we want, on the device I want. So why are we still using these industrial age approaches to designing meetings when instead we should be thinking about maximizing, as you said, the thing that is most unique, which is we're in the room. Let's get eye to eye. Let's weave different conversations with people. Let's get them out of the room. Let's get into nature. Let's leverage local food, architecture, art. Let's play, let's create, let's do the things that are most magical in person, not things that we could be doing on Zoom. I'll get off my soapbox because, as you can tell, I'll start to get passionate about this. Last thing, I just have to say this as a warning. If anybody's listening thinking, this guy's trying to convince us you can do magical things online, all of my online meetings are a drain. There is no such thing as Zoom fatigue. That is a misdiagnosis. It's unfortunate, right? What it's called is poor meeting design fatigue. It's called shitty facilitation fatigue. Sorry, I just have to call it what it is. We've got to take ownership. We can create magic even online. And if no one believes it's possible, come to one of our free live workshops that we still do once a month, and I'll show you firsthand.
I love it. We're going to take a quick pause. I love it. You know why? Because I was just going to ask you that. Are people zoomed out? So let's take a quick pause and come back to people being zoomed out. Hi there. I have something really cool for you. I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. You can check out all the details in the show notes. All you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcast, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobe@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course. You can also find other free goodies in the show notes. Go check them out. Okay, so let's go back to this because I love how you addressed it, Jon. You know, people are not zoomed out. The facilitation needs to be improved. So what kind of techniques or suggestions would you give, to teachers? Because to me, what I've seen, because I've experienced it and I want to continue experiencing what you guys have to offer. And like you're saying, I think there's a lot of people that might be a little bit skeptic, like really, like we do, we're all working from home and every single meeting every day is so boring or whatever it is. How do we avoid that? Like, what kind of things can we start shifting to avoid this Zoom fatigue and reframing it?
I'll speak to this by just going through we have a very basic operating system. It's a framework with some tools and steps that we take not only to design and facilitate a meeting, and I'll just pick a few things from each one, but also even in the things we do and how we invite people to the meeting. So we call it the initiate, design, and facilitate phases of any meeting. So let's just start with before we even log in, if we're talking about an online meeting, right? But all of this translates in person. So I mentioned earlier that this year our team will host 100, 150 plus online trainings and gatherings of different types. 95% or higher of all cameras will be on. But that's our culture. And I want to just point something out. It's not just that cameras are on, but people are having profound experiences. Well, if somebody were to come watch what we do, what they would notice is, yes, we have a really powerful culture in our online gatherings. But what I would hope they'd pick up on is the culture of the gathering doesn't start when we walk through the door of that event that you led last week. It doesn't start when we click on the Zoom link. The culture actually starts before they get there with the earliest touch points. It starts with the invitation to the gathering. So if anyone who's listening ever registers for one of our free workshops where they could meet me and experientially witness and learn everything I'm talking about, what they would notice is they'd get an email that has an ask for an agreement before they even show up. And the agreement is actually very simple. It's, hey, look, in this whole new world of meeting online, we're learning we've got to think about things maybe a little differently. And our ask is that people agree before they show up, are they able to be fully present? And if not, we say, don't come or come another time, right? But so the point here is the culture begins before, and the convener needs to take ownership of what agreements they're asking for up front. What am I standing for? What am I standing against? And in our case, we'll actually go out of our way to tell people not to come to something if they can't be fully present. And it's funny because anybody hearing this with any objectivity, how can you argue against, hey, we'll at least be present for each other? The funny thing is, if you look at how a lot of meetings actually materialize, that's actually an aspiration because people allow each other to be so distracted and multitask. They just tolerate it. For us, that's the lowest bar. Presence is the starting point. Now we're going to go deep and we're going to go far. But that has to do with how we invite people. So that's just one practical observation. Let's just talk about the design of a gathering. So when we look at designing a meeting, we look at different ingredients. How are we going to spend time? And let's just start with the most obvious. Most people, when they think about a meeting, they think about, well, what are we going to say? What are we going to present? Who's going to say what? Who's going to present what? That's fine. There's a place for that. When we look at a meeting, we're often starting with not just what is somebody going to say or present, but actually, what are the conversations that we're going to invite everybody to have? What are the conversations that are going to bring about learning and realizations and more self-awareness? What are the conversations that are going to strengthen the relationships between the people attending this meeting? And what are the conversations that, as we have these over time, can really transform a culture through the structure of how we're interacting? So let me just put this in really plain language. When we design a meeting, we're looking at the balance, the dance back and forth between information and interaction. And for us, a starting point is 50-50, right? Now, depending on the meeting, the purpose of coming together, who's in the room, yeah, that ratio could shift either direction for understandable reasons, but it's not uncommon for us to design a gathering, a meeting, a training where there's equally as much time where we turn the audience into the stage, the learners into the teachers, right? They're not just listening, they're sharing with each other. Maybe it's their reaction to what they just learned from somebody. Maybe it's their lessons they've learned trying to achieve something from successes or struggles. Or maybe it's their aspirations about the future, individually or collectively. And now I'm tipping my hat to the centerpiece of designing an interaction, which is really a conversation, is the questions that we design. Everything we do starts with and centers around what are the questions that when we bring it to a person or a group of people can create the most important transformation. And we can come back and talk about that. I'll just make one comment, Tanya, about facilitation, because to us, they're two sides of the same coin. If I want to create a transformational gathering, we've got to be exceptional at designing and facilitating. Facilitation, I think, is one of the more underappreciated competencies, capabilities. I'll give you an example. This will be the third consecutive year that I've had the honor of designing and facilitating an annual gathering called the CEO Summit for a community called the Conscious Capitalism Community. And this is a room full of CEOs who lead many of the most purpose-driven organizations in the world, ones that many of us, most of us have heard of. And it's a room that I'm privileged to get to facilitate them learning with and from each other. As a facilitator, here's what's fascinating. And I say this with all the humility I can possibly dig up as I say this. When I am designing and facilitating interactions where this room is sharing what they're learning, how they're adapting to change, how they're navigating complex issues, in many ways, whether people like it or not, I am the most influential person on that gathering. And let's just stop for a second and contemplate how significant that is. If I'm the one that has this privileged responsibility of introducing questions and conversations that everybody's going to have, that's a lot of influence. And so now I want to respect that influence, right? Through the effort I put in the preparation and in the moment. And if I can share with anybody just one practical insight on facilitation. Facilitating and being a great facilitator, it's really, if you want to be masterful at it, it's about understanding your whole job is to navigate attention and energy. That's it. And your job is not to be the star of the show. It's not about who you are or what you know. In fact, I facilitate 3-day gatherings and they don't know a single thing about me. I'm not there to teach. I'm there to ask so everyone else can teach. But a great facilitator almost becomes invisible because they're simply making the participants the stars of the show. And to do that, the facilitator has to go through an internal journey of being okay not being the sage on the stage, but instead the guide on the side. It's still very fulfilling. In fact, it's more fulfilling for me than when I'm asked to give a talk or a presentation, but it has to be held with reverence and respect. And I have to have done the inner work so that in moments where I can't control, right, control's an illusion anyways, when things happen that I didn't plan for or expect, and I call those the moments that matter most. And we teach that to our students. Because if I'm the facilitator of a meeting and somebody says something or something goes sideways, in that moment, people are actually going to accelerate their trust or lack of trust in me more than every other moment combined. Because it's when they see it's not scripted, it's not planned, they'll figure out who I really am. And I have a lot of influence, so I want to have done the work ahead of time. Whether it's contemplative practices, meditation, breath work, or a whole bunch of other things I'm trying to do so that I can self-regulate under pressure. Because as my nervous system goes, so will the whole room's. And so we teach our students not just how do you facilitate interactions, but how do you do the inner work so that you can hold the space where people can do difficult, complex things. So I'll stop because I'm sharing a lot. I don't know what's helpful or what's not, Tanya. You can take it wherever you want.
On a personal level, I'm getting my own teachings here with you, Jon, but let's go deeper into this part of facilitating because I do agree with you. I think it's very underestimated. And many of us will be in a position where we do have to facilitate, whether we have a job and we have meetings at our corporation, whether we're teachers, whether we're, I mean, any, like you said, any place where people convene and come together, like you want to create the space where people can connect. So I want to go deeper into facilitation. And you just said something that was very key to me that stood out: controlling versus allowing.
Mm,
Like many
yeah.
times we go in as like, oh, it has to be like this from this time to this time. We're going to teach this thing and then we're going to take them in this other direction. So let me pull out all my PowerPoint, presentation because we have to follow to the script. And then suddenly something goes, gets thrown off. How do you manage that? Like, can you talk to
Mm.
us for those that are wanting to hold on and control more of that room, that script, that presentation, that teaching versus, you know what, let me just listen to that energy, like you were saying, of information and energy and reading the room. Because that's,
Hmm.
as a facilitator myself, that's learning in the process. Obviously, I do not have this mastered. I'm still in the practice of it, but I've learned, like in this past retreat, that was what made it very different than the other ones that I've had, is there was a lot more allowing and being present and moving that
Mm.
energy versus trying to have it all controlled. So I'd love to hear
Hmm.
your perspective, Jon, on that.
Yeah, we have a saying that I was taught by a teacher of mine years ago, Mo McKenna, that you want to plan tight so that you can hang loose. And, it's actually a playful reminder of really a deep perspective, which is around striking a balance between structure and spontaneity, between masculine and feminine, between head and heart, between how precisely we've designed every word of every question. And I'll set the chairs in a room down to the centimeter and how far apart they are. And what plants do we bring in the room? What furniture do I get out of the room? What music is playing at what moments? Because of my experience, I can get really intricate into the details of everything people see, hear, feel in an experience, because there's an inseparable relationship between everything we see, hear, and feel and whether or not we tap into the capacity of that group. And yet, I need to also have designed the meeting, the gathering in a way that leaves enough breathing room so that there is space for something to emerge that you can't necessarily plan for, predict, or provoke, even if you try. And, so it comes down to appreciating the balance between structure and the liberating energy that structure can also allow for. You asked something around, lessons around facilitation. If I can, I actually want to speak for a moment to the role that many of us play when we're sitting in a meeting and we are not a designated facilitator, but yet that meeting really needs it. Because this is actually a very common situation, right? If I am formally the facilitator, well, then we got a whole universe we can talk about and how you prepare, design, and lead. But I actually want to acknowledge the more common situation. How many of us are sitting in a meeting and there's so many things about a group experience that can cause friction, tension, don't feel good. Then we have a meeting after the meeting, or we feel like we just didn't get to what we needed to, or the conversation didn't solve what it needed. I'll give you 4 or 5 really practical ways to facilitate without a title. Here's one. And this is starting with something that for me as the CEO, we have a small team. We got 14 people. So I'm working with our whole team and our leadership team. And I'm often looking at whether or not I'm the facilitator of the meeting. How can I help resolve or heal or improve in the moment? Because that's when we have to be able to do it. One example would be we're having a conversation and I'm realizing I don't feel prepared or I don't feel comfortable. And as an introvert, I might just ask our team, or a lot of times it's not me, which I'm very proud of, is someone else will say, hey, would it be okay? This is really important. I would love a minute to just gather my thoughts around what we're tackling here. Can I get just a minute? And by the way, when I ask for it, guess what everybody else does? They take that minute to gather their thoughts. Now, this could sound embarrassingly simple, and maybe it is, and that's good. But just the difference between people having a ritual or a rhythm of, hey, let's give ourselves a minute to stop, instead of expecting that everybody did some homework before the meeting. Why? That's delusional. Let's actually just honor reality and say, hey, can we take a minute and think about this, right? Or sometimes we'll be in the middle of a conversation in a meeting And there's no formal facilitator. But have you ever been, Tanya, in a meeting or a conversation where one person's talking about one thing, and then with good intentions, smart people, we're having one conversation, but then all of a sudden we realize we're actually having like 3 different conversations. Because in someone's attempt to solve this, they brought in something else, and then somebody's answering that, and we're literally having 3 different conversations. Once in a while, I or someone on our team will informally facilitate by saying, hey, I really want to honor everything that's being brought up here, but I'm struggling. Can we stop and align on what is the question that we're actually answering right now? Because I'm hearing answers to 3 different questions, and it's hard for me to know where to contribute. This is facilitating without a title. Another example is on our team, we're talking about something really important, and people are getting passionate and throwing ideas out. Once in a while, someone will stop and say, hey, can we just clarify, whose decision is it going to be? I love that because it doesn't default to me, the founder, or someone else who's the loudest person. It's like, oh no, actually, Stephanie, who's our steward of community, who's in the meeting, Stephanie, you're the owner. And it reminds people of how we are trying to distribute authority, right? I'll give you one more practical example, and I hope this is of some use to somebody, Tanya. I think one of the biggest sources of tension in relationships, in conversations, and in meetings is when unintentionally you have 1 or 2 or more people who are operating with the mindset of right now we're generating ideas. And then there's 1 or 2 or more people in that same conversation who are operating from a different mindset of we're actually converging, we're making decisions. Those are 2 different energies. Those are 2 different directions. And oftentimes groups of people having incredible tension and dysfunction because within a meeting, nobody's declared right now we're either generating ideas, which is divergent, or we're deciding, we're eliminating, which is convergent. And anybody without a title can be a great facilitator just by realizing what these sources of tension are, inviting a pause, getting clear on whose decision, getting clear on the question, getting clear on what type of conversation. I did not yet answer your question about how do we handle the moments that go sideways. Happy to come back to that, but because I just said so much, is there anything you wanted to say on any of that?
No, I'm taking notes myself, John. This is so beautifully said of we can all be facilitating as we're present in a meeting. But yes, talk to me more about the allowing or dancing with the unexpected when things show up that way in the meetings and the gatherings.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's obviously important if I'm leading a meeting how I'm going to handle it when things go sideways. And in our position, we're training our methodology for designing and facilitating, and we've met thousands of coaches and consultants, and they fill out an intake form before they come into our initial trainings. And we ask questions around what are your biggest challenges and concerns? And with as many people as we've worked with, there's patterns. And it's interesting, somebody who's newer to facilitating, maybe they've seen it done or they've seen the power of a group experience, but they've not done it before. They would be listening to this conversation thinking, what can I do to eliminate and avoid things going sideways? Over here, you talk to the folks who've got 20, 30 years experience. And without exaggeration, I'll tell you, the more experience somebody has, the more they actually pray for those moments to happen because of the point I made earlier, which is we can actually accelerate the trust, the safety in a room based on how well we hold the container during these moments that matter. But we can also lose it too. So what are the things that we teach that are both practical and then also kind of the deeper dimensions? So first things first, if I'm facilitating a group and somebody does or says something and things go sideways, I first want to share a belief that I have, because without a belief that matches the tools don't work, right? The inner needs to match the outer. So one of the beliefs that I have is, someone unmutes or grabs the microphone and says, hey, I disagree with everything being said right now. A confrontation, a real confrontation. I believe that oftentimes these people who hold these perspectives, whether it's confronting me, the process, or the room, or anybody in the room, where immediately there's almost a biological reaction to want to make that person kind of the outsider. And I think you can learn just by looking into Mother Nature, a living system. We are strong because of diversity. What makes us different is what makes us stronger if we know how to leverage it. I hold a belief that it is often the so-called person on the outside that holds the most important insight, wisdom, or gift for all of us on the so-called inside. So because I hold that belief, when somebody comes to me and says, Jon, we got a problem, there's a conflict over there, or it's obvious and something's happening, I've learned my intuitive reaction is there's going to be a gift for the room here. That's a very helpful internal reaction, right? But can you see how that belief is going to help me to appreciate, which actually becomes a practical technique, which is how do I appreciate what's emerging? I don't have to like it. I don't have to agree with it, but I can appreciate, or I can respect, or I can understand. If it's okay, I want to say, I also have a spiritual belief. I have a spiritual belief, and there's different ways of saying the same thing, that especially when things get most difficult, right? Because that's what we're talking about, not when everything's going according to plan. And this probably transfers outside of just facilitation. But when things go sideways, go wrong, get difficult, I have a belief that everything that happens to us is part of some curriculum that our soul needed. And I believe that that's true not just of me, but everybody in that room. Another way of saying it is there is nothing that ever happens in a room that's happening to that room. It's happening for the room. Now, it might be hard to accept that in the moment, but if I'm going to be the most responsible or conscious or aware person, which I try to do as the facilitator, I might be the only one that feels that way. But that feeling, that belief, that perspective can be very helpful when I then try and follow the practical steps that we teach, which is number one, breathe. When something goes sideways, breathe. Because even if I have a playbook for what to say, and we do, I won't be able to access that part of my brain if my nervous system is not well regulated, right? And the other cool thing is when things go sideways and everyone in the room, their stress rises, their heart rate rises, their heart rate variability goes out of whack, their coherence goes sideways, they get stressed because that's what happens. Well, there's a whole biological experience that's happening in the room. What is he talking about? Biological experience. It's true. We can actually measure it. And here's what we know. As my nervous system goes, so will the rest of the room. Because I'm the one they're looking at to see how I'm going to deal with this, right? So breathing, knowing how to breathe is the first thing, right? Then the first thing that I express ought to be gratitude. It ought to be, hey, thank you. Thank you, Tanya, for bringing your perspective forward. Now, do you notice as I'm doing this, hopefully, if you're watching or listening or feeling how you feel, when I say thank you, it feels authentic, right? Because if the words don't match what I really think, then it'll backfire. But because of what I believe, I am genuinely appreciative. And the amazing thing is just by thanking somebody, right? And if someone's like, is that all you say? Well, you can add to that. You can say, thank you for, and then you can point out something specific about them saying what they said. And watch this. I can build you up to the sky and back without having to agree with what you're saying. I can say, thank you for having the courage to share what you just shared. Because in my opinion, I think it would take courage to go against the grain. Or I could say, thank you for speaking your truth, because to me, if you're willing to do that, there's no condition more important in this room right now. So thank you for modeling that. I'm achieving a number of things there. But you notice, I can acknowledge you for some virtue or some value that you're probably not going to disagree with. If anything, you'll feel honored. You'll feel respected. You'll feel like you're being treated with dignity. And it doesn't mean I like what you're saying. It doesn't mean I agree with it. I think in a lot of ways, what I'm trying to point out here would solve a lot of our conflicts relationally and organizationally. If we could learn to have the humility that I'm not right, you're not wrong, that everybody's perspective needs to be dignified as equally valid, at least in the eyes of we're two humans having a human experience. So acknowledging, thanking, telling you why I'm thanking you. And here's the wild thing, and then I'm all done. As a facilitator, 90% of the time, I don't have to do anything else. Because this response that I'm sitting here talking through is so opposite of what everybody's preparing themselves for. They don't have any choice other than to diffuse within themselves, and then we can move on. Sometimes there's practical things that need to be addressed. But I'll stop there, Tanya. You'd asked, how do we handle these moments where things are out of control? And hopefully somewhere in all that is something of use.
Yeah, there's a lot of golden nuggets in there, Jon. Thank you for that. I'm going to take another quick pause before we wrap up. Hi there, I have something really cool for you. I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. You can check out all the details in the show notes. All you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcast, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobee@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course. You can also find other free goodies in the show notes. Go check them out. As we were talking about things going sideways, Jon, and what I sense from you, is just your capacity. You are so in tune with yourself and just being able to read the energy, being able to be in gratitude, being able to respond versus react to when you have someone that's in conflict in the room, and like you were saying, regulating your nervous system. Talk to me a little bit about your practices. What are some of your daily practices? Because it takes a certain person and certain practices to be able to facilitate in that way and hold space for everyone else.
Yeah, it's funny. I got a workbook I could probably pull up and point to 19 different practices that we teach. The whole reason I say that is because I just want to illuminate how big of a deal your question is to us when we're teaching somebody how to facilitate. Back in October, we were running an in-person event. We had about 90 folks from all around the world who'd come into the room. And there was one gentleman in the room by the name of Dr. Daniel Friedland. And I'd never met Danny as we got to know Dr. Danny, but I had dinner with him on, I think, the second night of that week. And I came to find out that Danny wrote one of the first textbooks on evidence-based medicine, which is a big deal. Somebody pointed out, they're like, yeah, that guy's done some work that has tilted how healthcare is practiced all around the world. But he was at our training because in kind of the second half of his career, he had written a book called Leading Well from Within, which is all about the intersection of neuroscience, mindfulness, and what it means to be a conscious leader, which is some of the things you were just acknowledging, the ability to be present and attuned and aligned and all these things. And the reason I'm telling you the story about the night I met Danny is because he said something to me that changed how we do all of our trainings. And the punchline is it's about practices. And he said, Jon, I'm sitting here in your all's training where I'm learning how to be a teacher that uses all this facilitation. And he's like, this is going to change my career. And he said, I got a question for you. He said, I can also see very clearly that you and your team have done a lot of this inner work stuff. And he said, but you're not talking about it. He said, do you think maybe it would be helpful for you to actually also talk about that? And I realized, yes, it's actually necessary. So from that point forward, we actually developed trainings both in partnership with Danny, and then we've added to them that bring in practices so that our facilitation students can also be committed to the kinds of things that cultivate that qualities that you're talking about. So for me, there's a combination. The practices that I've had the longest are mindfulness practices. I particularly prefer the basic mindfulness approach. It's now named Unified Mindfulness. And I've had the privilege of being taught and guided by the creators of that approach, Juliana Ray, who's kind of a lead trainer and an apprentice of Shinzen Young, who created that approach over 50 years ago. It's also the approach that many higher institutions like Carnegie Mellon and Harvard and MIT use when they want to measure the efficacy of mindfulness. And so mindfulness has played a big part for me. We've now taught that approach to thousands of our students. Breathwork practice.
Can I ask you before you go into breathwork, what does that entail? Is it sitting in meditation a certain amount of time per day? Like for anyone that's curious but has never really gone deeper into it, what is the unified mindfulness?
Yeah. So can we make this experiential?
Yes, let's do it.
I don't know, we can lead an hour version, a 7-minute version. I can try a 2-minute version of this. So please, if you're operating a vehicle, please adapt appropriately, okay? If any of you if you're listening right now and you're able to, I'm going to take you on a tour of the senses. If you want to slow down your breath, even adjust your posture to be able to be comfortable for the next couple minutes. And I'm going to guide you through everything you see, hear, and feel. And then after the tour, we'll talk about why did we do that, right? Because that's the answer to your question. So let's start with your eyes open. Again, don't do this if you're doing other things, and this would be dangerous. Thank you. Eyes open for the next 20 seconds or so. I invite you to simply see whatever is in your visual space. And if you want, you're welcome to fixate your attention, and I'll just keep repeating the word see as an anchor. And every time I say it, but also in the space between when I say see, you're welcome to just study the visual space. You might look at your desk or whatever's on the walls around you, see. You may choose to study the texture of the quality or the ceiling or the whatever you see. And all we're doing right now, what are we doing? We're just flexing a muscle, which is your awareness of what is outside of you visually see. Now, only if it's safe, please close your eyes. And I'm going to invite you to see in for the next brief moment. And when I say see in, my encouragement is, maybe there's images that come in and out of your mind's eye, see in. For some of us, it's like a movie theater, and sometimes we see what we don't, sometimes we see what we do want to see in. Some of us are wired where we don't see real images moving or still, see in. That's okay. There's nothing wrong either way. Maybe it's just with your eyes closed, you're imagining what the space outside of you looks like, see in. Maybe it's just the fuzzy, whatever that is on the inside of your eyelid. That's fine too, see in. Now we're going to transition. You can keep your eyes open or closed, either is fine, to here. And for the next brief moment, anytime I say here, you're welcome to notice whatever you hear, and I'm talking about externally. It's obvious and understandable that the sound of my voice might be the main thing here. There could also be things that you hear between the sound of my voice here. It could be the flickering of the air ventilation. It could be your computing equipment or vehicles or people in the background here. All we're doing is flexing this attention skill of noticing what we notice when we hear. If you want, you can keep eyes open or closed. We're going to hear in for just a brief moment. It could be the internal monologue or dialogue, hear in. If you talk to yourselves, it's that voice. If you don't, it's the one that said, I don't talk to myself, hear in. For some of us, it's louder. For some of us, it's quieter, hear in. Sometimes it's subtle or fleeting. Sometimes it goes and goes, hear in. Nothing wrong if you don't hear anything at all, hear in. It's just noticing. Do you hear anything between the two ears, hear in? Okay, we'll finish with feel. You can do this eyes open or closed. Feel out means notice anything physically and what we're going to call externally, feel out. It might be noticing your feet on the floor, feel out. It could be just noticing, what I will say is your breath moving through your body. We're going to call that feeling externally, a physical sensation, feel out. You might feel the texture of your clothing on your skin, the temperature of the air on your face, even the neutrality of it, feel out. We're just heightening, elevating, putting a magnifying glass on one attention skill, which is noticing what you notice when you feel out. We're going to finish now by feeling in. And as we do this, you may have guessed, it's noticing if you notice any emotional sensations, feel in. Sometimes they are associated with a physical location, sometimes not, feel in. You may notice a calm just understandably because of what we're doing, feel in. It's perfectly fine if you feel concern or anxiety or frustration. Maybe you don't like this moment in this conversation, feel in. It's all fair, it's all fine, feel in. Maybe it's significant, whatever feelings you feel. Maybe it's subtle, feel in. Maybe there's nothing at all, and that's fine too, feel in. Okay, we are now complete with our tour of the senses. Tanya, can I ask you a question?
Yes, please.
Without a need to kind of overthink it, is there anything you noticed, and there's no wrong answer, please, if you're willing to share, anything that you observed as you think about what that was like for you, anything that came up, or at any point when you think about what stands out or what you can notice, anything that comes up?
Calmness, slowing down, and being present. Those were the three main things.
Okay, calmness, slowing down, and being present. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing your experience. There's a possibility that 10 other people will have just sat through that same tour of the senses and have very different answers, which is fine. Some might say, I can't believe how distracted I am. Some will say I'm tired. Some will say I'm energized and I'm alive. And I would argue that what that tour did is it invited all of us to connect to how our entire life is experienced through our sensory modalities of see, hear, feel. So when you ask the question, well, Jon, what is your meditation practice like? And that all comes from a whole universe called unified mindfulness. Basic mindfulness is what it was known for the first 30 years or so. What I just led you through could be called a formal practice, or an example of a seated practice that I might do 5 to 10 minutes a day. But one of the reasons I have a bias for this approach to mindfulness is because when I'm facilitating a group, which is what I'm doing most, or somebody might translate this to when I'm in any situation where there's tension, pressure, things are at stake, this is a practice that I can actually also tap into as a real-time living practice. And there's tremendous practical utility to that. So even as I'm with you right now, because I've got enough years of formal practice with what I just showed you, I can actually be aware of what's arising within me. If I get distracted, I can catch it if it's a vision or a conversation. And in case anyone's wondering, like, oh, that sounds really useful. It is. What it allows me to do is even just by being aware of noticing what's arising, it can allow the thing that maybe would have gotten in the way or gotten a grip on me to dissipate. So I can come back here to this particular moment. So it's a practice that can be both formal. It's also something I can bring into any given moment.
Throughout the day and stuff. So that was beautiful. Thank you for guiding us through that, Jon. And before you were going to go on with breath work, and I interrupted you asking you what mindfulness was. So breath work you do on a daily basis too, or how, like what
Yeah.
other practices do you incorporate to ground yourself to be the facilitator that you are?
Yeah, well, and all of these practices to me can both live independently and they also can work together. So breath work is a great example of that. I had an experience 2 summers ago where I took my oldest boy, Ace, to Cooperstown, New York. When you're 12 years old, there's this like rite of passage experience in baseball where you go play in this tournament. And it was one of the best weeks of our lives. I got back and I had gotten a tick and I had gotten Lyme's disease. And I've never felt anything so physically devastating.
Oh, God.
I mean, I can't even put to words how it stopped my ability to live life. And we went about a month, like really without knowing what it was. And then finally we got some doctor to take a test. He's like, oh, this is it. I took an antibiotic. It was gone in like a day. But what happened is during that month, I was introduced to breath work through a teacher by the name of Lee Malice, who now teaches inside of our trainings as well. And I did breath work for 40 days. And I noticed that while I was dealing with all the struggles of the Lymes, I'm like, oh my gosh, my mental and emotional and what I felt was a spiritual and psychological stability and clarity was like nothing I'd experienced in my life. And I'd done a lot of things to try and work on myself. I'm always under construction, but the breath work, wow. So the beautiful thing about breath work is when you learn really basic breathing techniques, like for example, just to deepen my breath right now, right? Even as I'm with you, and allowing my inhales and my exhales to get deeper and to get slower, it's the fastest way to start to kind of balance out, harmonize my internal nervous system, my parasympathetic, my sympathetic, which is just a way of saying to get back to the place where I can be in an optimum place. And just deepening our breathing, right? And then there's a whole multitude of different ways to work with our breath. Wim Hof has become very popular. And I'm a fan of that, but I'm mostly using Kundalini breathwork practices that are more through the nose than the mouth. And the wonderful thing is in this day and age, I can go on YouTube. I do it with my kids. We do it before every sporting event, especially with actually all of my kids now. We do breathing in the last 15 minutes before we get to the game, just to get fully present, fully online, fully oxygenated. And I'd encourage anybody, if they're a skeptic, there's a great book. The title, I think, is Breath. And it's all about the intersection of all the science and research behind this, but it's also just ancient wisdom and how much it can help us to heal and solve some very simple challenges in our, personal ecosystem. So I'd encourage anybody to explore breath work if they're open to it.
That's wonderful. And the Lyme disease, you left me hanging with it. Gone? Nothing
Well,
left that,
I
John?
don't physically experience any symptoms. People say once
Yes.
you have it, it's you
Yes.
always do. I don't know. I have not had any of the symptoms. I did take an antibiotic and like literally within a day it was gone. Now,
That's
I've had people point out, they're like, is that why it's gone permanently? I have no idea. I know that thing saved me, the antibiotic. And whether it's the mindfulness, the breath work, every morning I start in a sauna and a cold plunge. I have different things I do to move my body, yoga, trail running, swimming, paddle boarding. I'm doing at least one or two of those every day. So the number of things that I do to try and get myself right is so many. I don't know which one to give the credit to. So I just keep doing as
that's
many things
great
as I
though.
can.
Thank you for sharing all of these, John. I think it's so important to continue, like I just see yourself with just this immense curiosity of wanting to, just better yourself as a human being and be able to transmit that to others, as we're talking here of this.
Mm.
We definitely have to do a follow-up episode. Like, I still have so many questions and I don't want to drag it off, but as we wrap up with this particular episode, John, what's something people can do, our listeners can do to live a life with more courage?
Oh, wow. That's a wonderful question. What is something that we can do to live a life with more courage? Huh. Wow. Well, where I go to, I've probably done this with all your questions, is I just think about when have I needed courage the most and what worked out for me there. And I think, I've had multiple personal and professional circumstances in the last 5 years where I've really needed courage. And when I think about those moments where things are most difficult, I think it's in those moments that when I'm wise enough, and I'm not always, to create the space for myself to get healthy. Because when I really need courage and I'm feeling stress or I'm feeling pressure, oftentimes my thought patterns are not healthy. And I try and remember that when I am feeling better, that try and recognize it when you're having really unhealthy thought patterns. And I'm doubting my ability, I'm doubting myself, I'm doubting my purpose, I'm doubting my work, I'm doubting my decisions or which direction to go. And I really need courage to keep moving forward. I think remembering to create the kind of space that will allow me to heal kind of from the inside out. And I don't think there's one way to do that. However many people hear this, there's that many different ways to do it, whether it's prayer or walking in the woods or contemplation or the things that we've talked about. The second thing I would say is when I've been in my lowest low points and I need to find courage, I've got to pay extra attention to who I surround myself with. And I've got to make sure that I stay in, and that can be through choosing which podcast I'm listening to. When I'm unconscious, I go in directions that in my head, I know it's not the best use of time and space. But when I'm more conscious and I really need courage, being around the people or in conversation or in relationship with people who are going to help me to reconnect to the resilience within, who are going to remind me what I'm capable of, or at least just help me to get back to present so that from that place I can find that courage. And for me, and I think we're all different, when I need courage the most, there's often a pattern that it's in those moments that I'm being most critical of myself. I'm judging myself. I'm beating myself up. And so for me, a doorway to courage is compassion and just reminding myself that wherever I am is okay. Whoever I am is okay. Maybe it's all divinely guided. Maybe it's not happening to me, but for me. And that just self-compassion, I think often gets me to a place where I can tap into that courage, if that makes sense. That's what comes up for me.
That is beautiful. I love it. I love because I ask that question all the time and it's always different answers. So that
That's
was
cool.
beautiful. Thank you for that one, John. Thank you so much for your time, for being with us today, and for sharing all your wisdom and your knowledge so that we can go out into the world and become better facilitators and connecting people with our differences and bringing everyone together, John. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tanya. It was awesome being with you.
Hi there. I have something really cool for you. I want to give you free access to my signature course called Manifesting Abundance, which typically sells for $997. You can check out all the details in the show notes, and all you have to do to gain access is leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, take a snapshot of it, and send it to help.thecouragetobe@gmail.com, and we'll get you set up with access to the course.